You are sitting across from someone you have known your entire life, and they ask a question so simple that it almost feels insulting. Did Adam and Eve really exist? At first, the answer seems obvious. Maybe you immediately say yes, because that is what you have always believed. Maybe you immediately say no because modern science appears to have settled the matter. But after giving your answer, something unexpected happens. You realize that you cannot explain why you are so certain, not without borrowing someone else's confidence, not without repeating arguments you inherited rather than discovered. That moment is more uncomfortable than the question itself. Most of us like to imagine that our beliefs are the result of careful thinking. In reality, they are often the result of familiarity. We absorb ideas long before we evaluate them. We inherit stories before we learn how to examine evidence. We join communities before we understand the assumptions that hold those communities together. By the time we become adults, many of our deepest convictions feel less like opinions and more like obvious facts. Challenging them feels strangely personal even when the challenge is respectful. That reaction tells us something important. Human beings do not simply believe ideas. We build identities around them. The story of Adam and Eve is one of the oldest and most influential stories in human civilization. Whether someone approaches it as sacred history, symbolic literature, theological truth, or ancient mythology, it has shaped countless discussions about morality, suffering, human nature, marriage, temptation, freedom, responsibility, and the meaning of life. That alone makes it worth examining carefully. The question is not merely whether two specific individuals once walked in a garden. The deeper question is why this story has survived for thousands of years, while countless other ancient stories faded into obscurity. Before rushing toward an answer, it helps to recognize that different fields ask different questions. Theology asks what God has revealed and what those revelations mean. History asks what can be established using surviving evidence. Archaeology studies physical remains. Genetics examines inherited biological patterns. Philosophy asks what follows logically from different assumptions. Psychology asks why certain stories resonate across cultures and generations. Confusion often begins when people expect one field to answer questions that belong to another. Imagine asking mathematics to explain why music moves people to tears, or asking poetry to calculate the orbit of a planet. Each discipline has strengths and limitations. The same is true when discussing Adam and Eve. Within many Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditions, Adam and Eve are understood as real individuals whose story explains humanity's relationship with God. Within other religious traditions, the narrative is interpreted more symbolically, emphasizing theological meaning over historical detail. Some believers argue that these approaches are not mutually exclusive. Others strongly disagree. Even within communities that share the same scriptures, interpretation varies more than many people realize. Outside religious traditions, historians generally point out that there is no independent historical evidence capable of confirming the existence of Adam and Eve as identifiable individuals in the way historians investigate later figures. That does not automatically prove they did not exist. History frequently deals with incomplete records. It simply means the historical method reaches limits. Historians are trained to distinguish between what evidence can establish, what evidence suggests, and what remains beyond verification. Those distinctions can feel unsatisfying because people naturally crave certainty. We want yes or no answers. Reality often offers probabilities instead. Genetics introduces another fascinating layer. Modern genetic research indicates that today's human population descends from a large ancestral population rather than a single breeding pair living at the same moment in the recent past. Many scientists see this as difficult to reconcile with a strictly literal reading of Adam and Eve as the sole biological ancestors of every human being. At the same time, some theologians and religious scholars have proposed different models that attempt to harmonize scripture with genetics, suggesting that Adam and Eve could occupy a unique theological role within a broader human population, or that the biblical account communicates truths that are not intended primarily as biological descriptions. These discussions continue among scholars, illustrating that the conversation is more nuanced than internet debates often suggest. Yet something interesting happens whenever this topic appears online. The discussion rarely stays focused on evidence. It quickly becomes a discussion about identity. A believer may hear criticism of Adam and Eve as criticism of their relationship with God. A skeptic may hear defenses of Adam and Eve as rejection of scientific inquiry. Both sides can begin defending themselves instead of examining the question. Psychology explains why. Our brains evolved to protect social belonging. For most of human history, exclusion from the group could threaten survival. Today, the stakes are different, but our instincts remain remarkably similar. We often defend the beliefs of our communities because those beliefs are woven into our sense of who we are. Changing our minds can feel like betraying the people who shaped us. That emotional cost is real, even when nobody says it aloud. Consider how children first learn about the world. They trust parents, teachers, religious leaders, and other authority figures because they must. A child cannot independently verify every claim about reality. Trust becomes a necessary shortcut. Most of the time, that shortcut serves us well, but eventually, adulthood requires something difficult. We must learn to distinguish between trusting people and evaluating ideas. Those are not the same thing. Questioning an idea does not necessarily reject the person who introduced it. Likewise, defending an idea should not prevent us from examining new information. The challenge is that our emotions rarely separate those experiences so neatly. This explains why conversations about origins become so emotionally charged. They touch questions that extend far beyond ancient history. Who are we? Why do we suffer? Are human beings fundamentally good, fundamentally broken, or something more complicated? Why does every culture wrestle with selfishness, guilt, love, sacrifice, violence, and hope? Whether Adam and Eve existed historically or symbolically, the narrative attempts to address questions that remain deeply human. That may explain why it continues to provoke discussion thousands of years after it first circulated. Another uncomfortable observation emerges here. Confidence is contagious. If enough people speak with certainty, uncertainty begins to feel like weakness. But certainty itself proves very little. Throughout history, confident people have defended ideas later shown to be mistaken. Other confident people dismissed ideas later supported by evidence. Confidence tells us more about the speaker than about reality. This is true inside religion, outside religion, and everywhere in between. Genuine intellectual honesty often sounds quieter. It leaves room for evidence, complexity, and revision. That does not mean abandoning conviction. It means recognizing the difference between conviction and infallibility. One reason the Adam and Eve discussion never disappears is that it exposes something universal about the human condition. We long for beginnings because beginnings help explain endings. If we understand where we came from, perhaps we will better understand where we are going. That desire exists whether someone opens a sacred text, a philosophy book, or a biology textbook. Each represents a different attempt to answer questions that have fascinated humanity since the dawn of civilization. Perhaps the most revealing question is not whether someone answers yes or no. Perhaps it is whether they are willing to examine why they answer the way they do. Is the answer grounded primarily in evidence, tradition, spiritual experience, philosophical reasoning, community loyalty, or some combination of all these influences? Most people discover that their beliefs are more layered than they first imagined. That realization can feel unsettling, but it can also become the beginning of genuine intellectual growth. Real curiosity is not about collecting arguments to defeat opponents. It is about developing the courage to let better questions reshape our understanding. If these conversations challenge assumptions you have carried for years and encourage you to think more carefully about history, belief, and evidence, consider subscribing and continuing the journey with an open mind. The moment you realize that intelligent, sincere, and well-informed people can study the same evidence and reach different conclusions is the moment certainty becomes more complicated than you expected. That realization can feel threatening at first, because we often assume that if the truth is obvious, everyone should eventually agree. Yet history tells a different story. People have disagreed for centuries about questions involving politics, morality, science, philosophy, and religion, often while acting in complete good faith. The existence of disagreement does not automatically mean there is no truth. It simply reminds us that human beings interpret evidence through lenses shaped by experience, education, culture, expectations, and identity. Think about how often you have changed your opinion on something completely unrelated to religion. Maybe it was a career decision. Maybe it was a friendship you misunderstood. Maybe it was a person you judged too quickly. At the time, your conclusion felt reasonable because it was based on the information available to you. Later, new information forced you to reconsider. That process is uncomfortable because admitting that you were incomplete feels strangely similar to admitting that you were wrong, even though those are not the same thing. The discussion surrounding Adam and Eve reveals this psychological tension more clearly than almost any other biblical account because it sits at the intersection of multiple ways of understanding reality. Some people approach the opening chapters of Genesis primarily as historical reporting. Others see them as ancient theological literature, communicating profound truths through symbolic language. Still others argue that these categories are too simplistic and that the text can carry historical, literary, and theological dimensions simultaneously. None of those positions exist merely because someone wanted to make life difficult for future readers. They developed over centuries as thoughtful people wrestled with questions that remain unresolved today. One of the most overlooked facts in these conversations is that ancient audiences often approached texts differently from modern readers. Today, many people instinctively ask whether an account is literally factual or fictional, as though those are the only possibilities. Ancient literature frequently operated with different expectations. Stories were often written to communicate meaning, identity, covenant, purpose, moral order, and humanity's place within the world. That does not automatically mean they were invented, nor does it automatically mean every detail was intended as modern historical description. Recognizing this difference helps explain why scholars spend so much time examining literary structure, cultural background, language, and historical context before reaching conclusions. Another uncomfortable reality emerges here. Modern readers often expect ancient texts to answer modern questions. We ask Genesis questions about genetics, anthropology, evolutionary biology, and archaeology that its original audience could not have imagined in the same way we understand them today. Meanwhile, Genesis addresses questions that many modern people rarely ask. Why does humanity experience alienation? Why do people hide after doing wrong? Why do shame and blame appear so quickly? Why does work become exhausting? Why are relationships complicated by selfishness? Why does every generation inherit both extraordinary creativity and remarkable capacity for destruction? Whether someone reads the account literally or symbolically, these questions remain remarkably recognizable. Walk through any ordinary day, and the themes appear everywhere. A parent promises patience but loses their temper. A couple blames each other instead of accepting responsibility. A successful professional achieves every external milestone, yet feels strangely restless. Someone spends years trying to impress people who never truly notice them. Another person convinces themselves that happiness lies just beyond the next purchase, the next promotion, the next relationship, only to discover that dissatisfaction quietly follows them. Human beings possess an extraordinary ability to recognize what is good, while simultaneously acting against their own better judgment. That paradox has fascinated philosophers, theologians, psychologists, and ordinary people for thousands of years. Regardless of where someone stands on Adam and Eve historically, few deny that the story captures something enduring about human experience. This is where confirmation bias quietly enters the conversation. Once we become emotionally invested in a conclusion, our minds naturally begin noticing evidence that supports it while overlooking information that complicates it. This tendency affects everyone. It affects committed believers. It affects committed skeptics. It affects historians, scientists, journalists, teachers, and students. Expertise reduces some errors, but does not eliminate human psychology. That is why responsible scholarship values peer review, debate, criticism, and transparency. The goal is not merely to collect evidence, but to challenge assumptions before they become invisible. Imagine two people entering the same library. One hopes to prove Adam and Eve certainly existed exactly as described. The other hopes to prove the story is entirely symbolic. Even before opening a single book, each person has already framed the investigation differently. Both may sincerely believe they are simply following evidence wherever it leads, yet expectations influence attention. Questions determine what we notice. This is one reason genuine intellectual humility matters so much. It reminds us that our minds are not perfectly objective instruments. They are powerful, creative, and remarkably capable of fooling themselves. There is another layer that people rarely discuss because it feels deeply personal. For many individuals, the story of Adam and Eve is connected to hope. If the account represents the beginning of humanity's relationship with God, then it also connects to larger theological ideas about redemption, purpose, and restoration. Challenging one part of that framework can feel as though the entire structure might collapse. Conversely, for someone who has rejected religious belief after painful experiences, defending a symbolic or non-historical reading may represent freedom from ideas they associate with fear or control. In both cases, the debate extends beyond evidence into biography. We carry our stories into every conversation. We never arrive as blank slates. This explains why two equally intelligent people can read the same article and walk away with opposite impressions. One finds reassurance, the other finds doubt. Neither reaction occurs in isolation. Each person interprets information through years of lived experience. Recognizing this should make us slower to dismiss one another. It should also make us more cautious about assuming that disagreement proves dishonesty. Sometimes people truly see the world differently because they began from different starting points. None of this means every conclusion is equally supported. Evidence still matters. Arguments still deserve careful evaluation. Historical methods still distinguish stronger claims from weaker ones. Scientific research still refines our understanding of human origins. Theological reflection continues to examine Scripture within living traditions. Philosophy continues asking what follows from different assumptions. These disciplines contribute different pieces of a much larger puzzle. The mistake occurs when we expect one discipline to answer every possible question by itself. There is a temptation, especially online, to reduce complex discussions into slogans. Adam and Eve definitely existed. Adam and Eve definitely did not exist. Science destroyed Genesis. Genesis disproves science. These statements spread quickly because simplicity travels faster than nuance, but reality rarely fits inside slogans. Serious inquiry usually replaces absolute certainty with deeper understanding, rather than with easy answers. Perhaps that is why thoughtful conversations often attract fewer people than heated arguments. Anger feels decisive. Reflection requires patience. Yet patience is where genuine learning often begins. Ask yourself a different question. If tomorrow undeniable evidence appeared supporting the historical existence of Adam and Eve, would you accept it? If tomorrow equally undeniable evidence demonstrated that Genesis should not be read as literal history, would you accept that instead? Your answer may reveal less about Adam and Eve than about your own relationship with truth. Most of us like to believe we follow evidence wherever it leads. The harder question is whether we are willing to follow it when it leads somewhere unexpected. That willingness demands courage because changing your understanding can alter relationships, traditions, and even your sense of self. It is much easier to defend familiar territory than to explore unfamiliar ground. Yet nearly every meaningful discovery in human history required someone willing to risk uncertainty in pursuit of greater understanding. Maybe the most enduring power of the Adam and Eve story is not that it forces everyone toward one conclusion, but that it continues forcing every generation to wrestle with the same fundamental questions. Who are we? Why do we long for meaning? Why do we struggle with guilt, freedom, responsibility, and hope? Why do we seek explanations for suffering? Why do stories possess the power to shape civilizations across thousands of years? Whatever answers we eventually reach, those questions remain. And perhaps learning how to approach them honestly, carefully, and humbly says as much about our humanity as any conclusion we finally embrace. Every generation eventually discovers the same uncomfortable truth. The hardest questions are rarely the ones with the least evidence. They are the ones whose answers might require us to become different people. That is why the discussion about Adam and Eve has survived empires, revolutions, scientific discoveries, religious reforms, and cultural transformations. It refuses to stay confined to ancient history because it keeps returning to something much closer than an archaeological site. It returns to the person staring back at you in the mirror. Long before you ever wondered whether Adam and Eve were historical individuals, you had already developed assumptions about authority, trust, evidence, and meaning. Those assumptions quietly shaped every conclusion that followed. Most people never notice this process because beliefs rarely arrive one by one. They arrive together. They form networks, accept one idea, and several others naturally begin to fit around it. Challenge one central belief, and suddenly dozens of connected beliefs begin to feel unstable. That is why questioning can feel exhausting. It is not because the evidence is necessarily overwhelming. It is because your mind is trying to reorganize an entire framework that may have taken decades to build. This happens in religion, but it also happens in politics, science, economics, family traditions, and personal identity. Human beings crave coherence. We want our worldview to fit together. When something threatens that coherence, we instinctively look for ways to restore it. Sometimes we restore it by discovering better explanations. Sometimes we restore it by ignoring uncomfortable information. The difficult part is that both responses can feel emotionally similar while they are happening. This is one reason intellectual humility is so valuable. It reminds us that confidence alone cannot distinguish between genuine understanding and well-defended assumptions. There is another tendency that quietly influences conversations like this. We often imagine there are only two kinds of people, those who blindly believe and those who courageously question. Reality is rarely that simple. Many believers spend their lives asking difficult questions without abandoning their faith. Many skeptics remain deeply committed to following evidence wherever it leads, rather than simply rejecting religious claims. Likewise, there are people on every side who avoid complexity because certainty is emotionally comforting. Honest inquiry does not belong to one worldview, it belongs to a mindset. The willingness to examine your own assumptions is far more important than the label you place on yourself. If you study the history of ideas, you discover that progress often begins with people who were willing to admit the limits of what they knew. They understood that saying "I do not know" is not intellectual failure. It is often the beginning of genuine discovery. Unfortunately, our culture frequently rewards certainty more than curiosity. Social media algorithms favor decisive statements over careful reasoning. Debates become competitions instead of conversations. People cheer for the side that sounds strongest rather than the one that asks the most illuminating questions. But truth has never been obligated to follow popularity. It has never depended on applause. Whether discussing the origins of humanity, the nature of consciousness, or the existence of God, reality remains exactly what it is, regardless of how many people agree about it. That can be unsettling, because it means none of us can vote our way to certainty. We must keep learning, keep examining, and remain willing to refine our understanding as new evidence and better arguments emerge. Consider one final thought experiment. Imagine two people leaving this conversation. One concludes that Adam and Eve almost certainly existed as real historical individuals. The other concludes that the Genesis account is better understood primarily through its theological and literary purpose, rather than as a literal historical record. If both reach their conclusions after honestly engaging with the strongest arguments, acknowledging the limits of available evidence, and remaining open to future learning, they may actually have more in common than either realizes. Both have demonstrated intellectual integrity. Both have resisted the temptation to confuse certainty with truth. Both have recognized that difficult questions deserve careful thought rather than instant reactions. That may be the deeper lesson hidden beneath this entire discussion. Mature thinking is not measured by how quickly we answer controversial questions. It is measured by how responsibly we investigate them. Perhaps the story of Adam and Eve continues to matter, regardless of where one ultimately lands on its historical status, because it keeps exposing timeless aspects of human nature. We still reach for certainty. We still fear uncertainty. We still search for meaning. We still wrestle with responsibility. We still struggle to distinguish what we wish were true from what evidence allows us to conclude. And we still discover that sincere people can disagree while sharing a common desire to understand reality more clearly. That realization should not discourage us. It should encourage patience. It should encourage better questions. It should encourage listening before assuming, examining before dismissing, and thinking before repeating what everyone around us already believes. In the end, the question, did Adam and Eve really exist, is not only about the distant past. It is also about the kind of thinker you choose to become today. Will you settle for inherited certainty simply because it feels comfortable? Will you reject ideas simply because they are ancient? Or will you accept the slower, more demanding path of weighing evidence, recognizing complexity, and allowing your conclusions to remain proportionate to what can actually be known? That path rarely offers the satisfaction of absolute certainty, but it offers something more valuable: intellectual honesty. And whatever conclusion you eventually reach, that honesty will serve you far beyond this single question. If this exploration challenged you to think more carefully, question more thoughtfully, and appreciate the difference between conviction, evidence, history, and belief, then stay with this channel. Not because it promises easy answers, but because the search for truth is often more meaningful than the comfort of unquestioned certainty.